Everyone agrees the answer is to build more houses. The trouble is, where? We can reveal today that a government wheeze to make things easier has actually backfired. Now, an investigation by the Sunday Politics shows 3/4 of local councils do not have plans in place for building more houses. It's 2 years since the government scrapped centrally imposed targets. The idea was to let councils decide where houses should be built after listening to local people. The trouble is they listened and people told them to get lost, with the result that there's a chronic shortage of house building. We asked our political reporters to give us the latest situation in their areas. We start in Somerset.
Planning's always been a bit of a tricky subject for councillors. After all, it's not the most popular thing in the world to agree to the building of a new housing estate, especially on green open spaces like this one. But under the last government, local politicians could blame Westminster, as it was them telling us in the West how many homes were needed.
Well, now we lack any sort of strategic, wide area framework for housing numbers and objectives and so on. And each council has to determine its own figures. And the problem is with that is that it's very difficult to find a way through the political process of sometimes accepting things which people locally might find unpleasant and undesirable, really, basically.
Over the last 2 years, I've spent many hours sitting in council chambers like this one, where the debate has been by councillors just how many homes are needed, but agreement has been hard to reach.
Obviously, the councillors work in a political environment as well, and therefore they've got different filters. They'll see things differently to us, and that's all part of the system. We'll give them the baseline information and the best advice we can, but in the end it's over to them to try and fit those housing numbers into the society which they live.
Out of the 17 local authorities across the West, 4 have housing plans officially agreed by the government. But at least 5 tell me they don't expect to have their plans signed off for at least another 2 years. But the problem is, without plans in place, development across the West is not being decided by local communities and councillors, but it's being left up to the planning inspector and even the courts to decide.
Here at City Hall in Bristol, the politicians agreed their housing numbers last year. The challenge for the new mayor of this city is to find sites for all these homes, and fast.
But that's not going to be easy when you're faced with local people fighting against new developments in their backyard. The National Housing Federation say councillors need to get a move on.
There's a very significant shortage. We know that we're only building around 60% of the homes that we need, and we've been doing that year on year on year, which means that house prices are incredibly high, people are struggling to find an affordable place to live, and we really need to start tackling this problem.
There's surely nothing better than a nice country walk on a crisp winter's day. Many people, of course, choose to move to the countryside, to the green lungs away from the urban sprawl, like here on the outskirts of Warminster in Wiltshire. What people probably don't realise is much of that green space is actually privately owned, therefore making it rich pickings for developers.
And that creates tensions. These campaigners don't want their views over green fields swapped for a housing estate with 320 new homes. They say councillors and the government must not side with developers, but listen to local people.
I believe the council now needs to look strategically at development round this market town in order to ensure that it's balanced and sustainable. This particular speculative proposal is not sustainable and is unbalanced and will have a major impact on the infrastructure of this town.
The dilemma for our local politicians is for every person who says you must build more homes, there's a local community fighting against overdevelopment.
Well, joining the debate is Chris Winter, who's a property developer from Taunton. Welcome to our little front room. How difficult is it for you to get a housing development underway in the West Country?
It's certainly becoming more challenging. I think the core strategy process that is being gone through by a lot of local authorities has been slow and protracted, and the planning process itself has become more onerous, both in terms of...
13 out of 17 of our local authorities haven't got their housing plans together. Does that cause you a lot of problems?
It does, because housing numbers haven't been allocated. Therefore, there is no due process. There's a shortage of allocated sites, and land supplies, therefore, not there for housing.
So why can't they get their act together?
That's a very good question.
Why do you think?
I think the process is very protracted. Resources within local authorities are perhaps not there, and I'm sure the system is becoming more politically driven, and therefore councillors are having difficult decisions to make with their ward members and electorate.
The problem is, of course, nobody wants a housing estate right next to them, particularly if they're overlooking a nice view, and yet the houses are needed, or are they needed? Is the demand exaggerated, do you think?
It's definitely not exaggerated. Definitely there is demand. There's a demand for both open market and affordable housing. Where we operate in Taunton, a housing waiting list of 4,000 people. There is definitely demand, and we as developers wouldn't build if there wasn't a market. We wouldn't just be building for fun. So
yeah, people can afford them, of course. Let's bring in our other politicians. I mean, this is a failure, Rob, isn't it, of localism. The government said it would be a good idea, let the councils decide. We won't impose central targets, and then it hasn't happened.
Well, where we are at the moment is a transitional phase between the old policy, what was called the regional spatial housing targets, and a newer policy of localism. And in particular, you've seen a number of appeals and decisions being made in this sort of hangover period. I believe that with localism and with the emerging local plans that we've been talking about, that there will be far more local understanding and a far more sense of ownership about what's going to happen locally. Now, what we've got to do is try and make planning popular again. I think members of the public feel that these applications are sprung upon them, and developers themselves have to learn better ways in which to engage the public at a much earlier stage and talk through with them the benefits of planning gain. I mean, Swindon, for example, has been a growing town for generations, and we have benefited in terms of infrastructure and leisure facilities as a result of planning gain.
Amanda,
that needs to be explained once again, I think.
Let's bring in Amanda. I mean, this isn't a new problem. It's been going on for years and years in Britain. How do we build more houses, and how do we make them acceptable to people in localities?
Well, I have to agree with a lot of what Rob was saying there, because it is a political hot potato, and as you say, the councillors are all thinking about their electorate as much as they are thinking about the good of the whole, and it's a balancing act all the time. So maybe the planners need to get a little bit more savvy, how they do more community engagement, maybe at the early stages, rather than thrust it on them at the latter stages and saying this is what's happening. I think you need to bring people in with you at the early stages.
Is that possible, do you think? Can you sort of crawl up to local people and sort of try and persuade them before you put the plans in? Is that possible?
Yeah, you
have to do it. That's part of the process now. It's required as part of the preparation of a planning application. The problem that we have with the term localism is what does it mean? And when localism was first sort of muted, certainly it appeared to us that it became the NIMBYs, they're not in my backyard. It's so we can object to everything, as opposed to local authorities and local communities making decisions. And that, if you can engage with the whole community, the whole town, not just those that are directly affected, and say, is this the right place for development, then you can certainly engage, and you aren't going to win everybody over, but at least you can allow them to influence perhaps how the development...
The planning minister is suggesting that we build on another 2 to 3% of England to try and sort of free up more land for more homes. That, he says, would sort out the housing problem. Do you agree?
Well, I think Nick is right to say that there is a housing problem and there is a shortage of supply. But
this is Nick Bowles, the
planning. But it's where you do it, and the fact is that there is demand in the south of England. We tend to be, we are becoming more and more overcrowded, I believe, in the south of England. So I think it's a little too easy to just say let's find an extra 3%. The question is where. Now, the Swindons of this world have been and continue to build, and I think it's incumbent upon other areas to say, right, we'll take our fair share too, to spread out and balance this demand.
Amanda, you want to represent an area, sort of Bristol South, of course, home to the vast council housing estates there. I mean, should there be more building in that sort of area? Should we perhaps stretch out, I don't know, into Dundry or wherever?
Well, I have to express a personal investment because I have a beautiful view of Dundry from my bedroom window. So, of course, we go back to the NIMBYism and all the rest of it. But I think we've got such density of housing in South Bristol. If anything, we need to get more infrastructure there of different things. We need more shops, we need more cinemas. It's just huge swathes of housing, which can be very sort of depressing for people if there's nothing to do there.
OK. All right. Excuse me, before we choke, we have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. Good to see you.